never works. I would like to invite Moneycontrol Associate Editor Vandana Ramnani, who will moderate this next session. Should I go in? Huh? Hello, 1, 2, 3. Mother. Sorry. You sit here. Sit here. Hi. Arjun. Welcome to Moneycontrol's session on building cities of tomorrow, sustainable urban renewal and climate financing. With me today are Chandra Bhushan, who is CEO iForest International Forum for Environment, Sustainability and Technology. He's an urban planner. And I have with me Madhav Raman, who is principal and co-founder at Angraman Architects, and I have with me Arjun Dutt, who's a senior program lead at Council on Energy, Environment and Water, and I have with me Neha Kumar, who is the head at South Asia Program Climate Bonds Initiative. Yeah? So we're going to discuss this topic on building cities of tomorrow, sustainable urban renewal and climate financing. Now, as you all know, cities face unprecedented challenges, including the increasing risks of climate change and environmental disasters such as urban flooding. And 70% of the greenhouse gas emissions emanate from cities due to high levels of economic activity, making them major contributors of climate change. And this year's budget in particular had looked at making cities self-reliant and incentivizing cities to improve their creditworthiness for municipal bonds as well as property tax governance reforms, right? Now, it is also projected that by 2036, 40% of India's population will be residing in urban cities. And this will add further strain on the already limited urban infrastructure and services, with an increased need for clean drinking water, dependable power supply, safe and efficient road transfer, and other essential services. And also 75% of this funding for city infrastructure comes primarily from state governments, and urban local bodies contribute about 15%, whereas private finance contributes a meager 5%. So my first question to all of you is, how do we meet the shortfall of this funding? Now, how will private funding be encouraged? What steps have been taken so far in terms of raising private funding, and what more needs to be done in this direction? Yeah.
Thank you, and thank you very much for inviting me. I think it is, first of all, I'll just pick up from a comment that you gave, that 40% of India is going to live in cities in 2040, something like that. It depends on how you define a city. Our current definition of city is that if you have 5,000 people and population density is 400 person per square kilometer, right, and 75% of people are in non-agricultural activity, then you call that area as an urban area.
Right.
Now, I have never understood the reason of defining an urban area based on economic activity. You could have a city where 50% people are engaged in farming, but still it is an urban area. Now, if you remove that component of economic activity, then 65% of India is already urban. And the number of studies that has happened, which essentially says that just change the definition and you will have to have close to 15,000 urban local bodies in India.
Okay.
Right now we have about 4,000,
4,000.
5,000 urban local bodies. So one, I think fundamentally, the problem of urbanization in India is also a problem of defining what is urban, what is non-urban. The second part, which is important and related to this, is now more people live outside the municipal boundary than within the municipal boundary. Now look at Bangalore, or for example the city of Delhi. The peri-urban population has ballooned over the last 30, 40 years.
That's right.
So while the entire focus is on what we do within the urban municipal boundaries, the fact is peri-urban areas are in real trouble right now. They don't have basic infrastructure. We keep building, housing and providing marketplaces in peri-urban area. But the fact is the connection between peri-urban area and urban area is not understood. So I believe money is important, but we need to get some of the basics right in our urban planning and urban development, which we are not doing. And the classic case is urban governance. We are sitting in a city where no one knows who is responsible for what. And I'll give you an example of urban drains. There are 16 agencies in Delhi who own urban drains. So there's no one agency which is responsible. When this flood happened, the question was, who is responsible for making sure that the drains are cleaned? And there are 16 agencies. 10 of them are with the state government, 5 of them are with a central government, and 1 is with army, cantonment area. They also own your drains. So my first intervention will be, there is more to urban problem and building city of the future than only investment. I think investment is important, but for India, getting the basics right, I believe is far more important.
Now, coming to you, Arjun, I mean, can you tell us, the avenues which are currently available for private funding to come in for, this basic infrastructure development, and also why would a private fund want to invest if, the infrastructure that needs to be developed is not commercially viable?
Right. No, that's a very pertinent question. And let me start with a bit of context. So as you pointed out in your remarks, when we're talking about urban infrastructure, you're really talking about projects that are quite heterogeneous across segments like energy, energy efficiency, transport, water, sanitation, right? Now, all of these, depending on the activity, the city in which they're located, are actually characterized by different levels of commercial viability.
Right.
And because of that, private investment, depending on the level of viability, which is determined by the underlying business model as well as the extent to which user fees are market reflective, private interest can vary. Now, if I were to look at private investment, broadly it can take the form of either direct participation in projects or, let's say, investment in capital raising activities of public sector actors. So let's sort of take these one at a time. If I were to look at areas where private capital would be comfortable directly investing, those would be those projects or activities where there's a clear business case or almost commercially viable business case. Some examples of these are private sector discoms or private discoms in large cities. For example, Adani Electricity Mumbai Limited is one of the most profitable discoms in the country. Similarly, very recently, another Adani company, Adani Energy Solutions Limited, secured 1 billion in financing to build an HVDC transmission network to help the discom actually procure the renewable power. So these are examples of commercially viable, urban infrastructure where money would readily flow. Then there are some areas where viability is almost established, and even this is of interest to private investors. Consider the auctions of electric buses by CESL. We've seen a lot of interest by private sector participants. There have been some concerns about the viability of tariffs discovered in the latest rounds, but generally it's an area where money flows readily. But what can be done to increase viability further? Let's take this as a case in point. One of these is to use blended finance instruments such as guarantees to address specific concerns of investors. In this case, the creditworthiness of state transport corporations is a particular, issue that concerns investors. So, for example, a blended finance solution or a guarantee funded by public money, that can be domestic or international, that can help allay this concern for investors, can help crowd in more capital. Other solutions that have been deployed internationally are the utilization of carbon credits to help, generate alternative revenue streams and thereby increase the viability of the project and therefore making it more attractive to investors. A recent case in point is the collaboration between Switzerland and Thailand with regards to the privately operated electric buses that are plying on public sector bus routes in Bangkok. Now, under this collaboration, under Article 6.2, the Swiss government has committed to buying around 500,000 carbon credits by 2030. Now, what this will do is it will generate additional revenues that will bridge the gap between the total cost of ownership of diesel buses and electric buses, and thereby allow Bangkok to have ticket prices for buses stay at the same level, even after electrification. So these are some innovative ways in which the viability can be improved and public capital can be attracted. Now, having said that, not all segments meet the criteria of viable or nearly viable commercially. And also some sectors like water and sanitation, right? They are important public goods, and if private players were to provide these services, you could have the challenge of poor sections of society that are not able to pay market-reflective user charges being excluded from access to these services. Okay. So it's actually desirable for such kinds of services and infrastructure that public bodies invest. And in these cases, that public investment can be at the central level, state level, municipal level, or even international public capital through various ways. And in this case, how can private capital participate? They can invest in the bond issuances that are issued, municipal level, central level, depending on, the issues that are of interest, depending on viability and other considerations. And that is how private capital can also play a role in enabling these public actors to provide these services.
Arjun, now that you mentioned this, what about cases such as, sewage treatment plants? Now, sewage treatment plant, if the private funding were to come in, I mean, if these guys were not given commercial rates, why would anybody want to set up a sewage treatment plant? But it's an important service nevertheless. What happens in such a case?
Right, so like I just mentioned, that in terms of areas where if you provide if the private sector were to provide, it will not have the right kind of service levels, especially for marginalized sections of the population. It is incumbent on the municipalities or the other levels of government to provide. Municipalities can provide this if, for example, they have the right kind of budget surpluses that enables them to, if they were to go to the bond market, achieve a kind of credit rating that would make it attractive for investors. So, for example, we've seen the likes of Indore and Ghaziabad raise green bonds. And when you say sewage treatment or water management, such kinds of, issuances can conceivably come under the ambit of green bonds. And that is why it becomes, a good avenue to channel capital. So, of course, that depends on the municipality. If they have the the credit rating to access the bond market, otherwise, there are other ways. Maybe there can be a sovereign green bond rating that can help channel capital from the center towards municipalities. And there are other ways. But of course, ultimately, in order for municipalities, as Chandrabhushan also said, that we're going to have so many municipalities in India in the future, at the same time, it's incumbent for municipalities to develop roadmaps towards more balanced budgets that can enable them to be more independent in the long term in terms of capital raising. But of course, in the short and medium term, there are various options for funding those kinds of projects as well.
Neha, coming to you, can you tell us something about the credit worthiness of cities? How can that be established, and which cities are, better placed to raise these private finances, and how?
So thank you for that question, but I'll also, before answering that question, I'll also take the liberty of saying something and joining the dots between what CB said and what Arjun said. I think fundamentally there are a couple of things that one has to look at when you're talking about raising financial resources. More and more the need of more private capital to come in. I think structurally, cities in India are simply not empowered to raise that kind of financial finances. They are not fiscally autonomous units. They depend upon states and grant. They depend upon, and they're also not, they're not, they don't come to the market that often. So their own governance and the kind of scrutiny that actually market borrowing exposes them to, it is not something that they are naturally attuned to or even capacitate. Their capacities are completely lacking. When I say completely, largely lacking in most of the cities. At the same time, you know, before we started this discussion, somebody was saying that, the anchor was saying that the cities have to begin from live spaces and buildings. So I think joining from what she said, what CB said is that there are so many things that happen in the city, whether that is the dwelling spaces, whether that's roads, whether that's water and sanitation, supply of water, all of that are function of basic governance plus the ability to raise finance. Okay. Now, going back to what Arjun was saying, that different projects will have different kind of commercial viability. What I am seeing basically is that public projects and private projects are sort of happening in parallel. The structures that should actually be given more attention, like public-private partnership structures, they really need to be given more attention. Having said all of that, what I also would like to share with the house over here is that, you know, between I think in a span of about 8 to 10 years, the frequency of environmental, climatic stresses and extreme weather events has increased by 200% in India. Okay? I'm returning from Bombay. I spent about 2.5 hours on the road. And you see all of those, the cities being, you know, facing the heat island phenomenon, the stresses, they're humongous. So when we have to look at raising finance, we also have to look whether the cities will be habitable spaces themselves, which means that we cannot exclude the green aspect of it. When we look at the green aspect of it, then there is a window of opportunity that currently lies, especially with the municipal bodies as well as urban local bodies, because a lot of what they do actually broadly falls into the definitions of what we can call green. And in fact, after the sovereign bond issuance, you know, which was a very interesting step that happened in India, one, that it was successful. Second, the success was seen immediately in terms of interest by public bodies, including municipalities, of coming to the market in order to, Arjun did mention Indore and Green, which Ghaziabad, which had happened before the sovereign issuance. But now, you know, more and more municipalities are talking to us about green bond issuances. But I have to say that you cannot just simply self-label yourself that I'm a green issuer. There has to be a process around it, because the fundamental difference between tapping this opportunity, which is very much there, and finance as usual, is the transparency on the use of proceeds. And that is extremely important. It is not exactly easy, also because there is inertia, sort of legacy issues. But I can tell you that nearly 4 to 5 municipalities have actually approached us for green bond issuances. There is one more thing I want to just conclude the opening remarks with, that as far as city level financing in India is concerned, we have always been in a pilot stage. Okay. You know, there are those 3 or 4 municipalities which come to the market. They also do not come regularly enough. So there isn't enough predictability even for investors. And the hard work that is required to get your own governance in order is also not structured. So cities can come, urban local bodies can come in different structures, in PPP structures, in joint ventures with public bodies and on their own. But let me tell you right now that within the corporate issuance volume,
Right.
okay, municipal issuances form about 0.012% of the total corporate debt market of India. Okay? It is as minuscule as this. And the urban infrastructure capital investment till now stands as about 10.6 billion USD per annum. What we need is 56 billion USD per annum till to 2030. Where is this money going to come from? This is, even if you say central and state resources, those budgetary resources will be very constrained. But unless you empower the city bodies, and that will actually call for serious relook at your reforms, governance reforms, plus your constitutional powers. I mean, if you cannot raise resources, then all of these are sort of tinkering that we will do. But there is opportunity over there, and one has to, it's not the cities of tomorrow, I think it's cities of today. And, you know, just very naturally, the policy makers, the legislators have to think about how to empower cities. Otherwise, the kind of climate and environmental stresses and population stresses that we are going to see, I don't think that the center and state will be in a position to help the cities if that is the center of growth that we are looking for.
Okay. So, Arjun, would you want to comment on whether, you know, what Neha said is also a very big challenge when it comes to attracting international funding in this segment? Because of this, what she mentioned as self-labeled bonds, I mean, is that a challenge?
Yeah, so I think Neha made a very important point that the difference between self-labeled and certification is that third-party, you know, check that everything is kosher. So, for example, this is particularly important if cities are looking to attract international investors. And that is important because when with green bonds, we've seen that the international investors, if they're present, there is a greater likelihood of pricing advantage or even greenium, right, for issuances. To achieve this, what is necessary, like Neha pointed out, are, you know, addressing concerns over governance, particularly those pertaining to transparency and disclosure when it comes to things like issuances, green bond issuances at the municipal level. In this context, incidentally, the sovereign green bond framework that is already been spelled out offers a wonderful exemplar that municipalities can use to emulate systems and processes that can help, you know, them to allay these concerns for investors. Because our sovereign green bond framework conforms to international standards and provides defined processes or defined steps for the kinds of activities that Neha pointed out: use of proceeds, project evaluation and selection, management of proceeds and reporting. So I think with these kinds of steps, I think there is, it's more feasible to have greater number of issuances, of course, while addressing other concerns.
But let me just clarify one thing. Just cities cannot raise international finance directly. That is simply not possible.
Yeah.
However, if you have special purpose vehicles, Arjun, that's the only way you can actually attract international finance. We are very much guided. I mean, we will only be able to play when we are talking about the constitutional limitations. We'll only be able to play within the domestic market. But the point is well made that the domestic market, they will have to go to the domestic market more and more. For that, you need a pipeline. For that, you need robustness. And there, I think what the sovereign green bond has done is quite amazing, because that was a domestic bond in INR onshore, and that has really done well and has given a very good signaling effect in the market.
Thank you for pointing that out. That was something that I had left out. So indeed, you would need a special purpose vehicle, and alternatively, there is also the fully accessible route that the government has introduced. So special purpose vehicle and introducing a fully accessible route, making them eligible for that, can allow international investors or more international investors to help access these kinds of funding opportunities.
Now, coming to you, Madhav, India's G20 presidency has instituted a disaster risk reduction working group whose priorities include the global coverage of early warning systems as well as mobilizing finance to combat disasters, right? Now, where do we stand in terms of preparedness for cities for future challenges that emanate from climate change, such as the recent flooding that we witnessing in hilly states, right? So where do we stand in terms of preparedness when it comes to natural disasters such as flooding?
If you'll pardon the pun, we stand on unfirm ground. And I think I want to carry on this conversation that CB, Neha and Arjun have started. I think it's important to understand urban planning, urban regeneration, firstly from the context that CB had pointed out, which is to say that what is urban, right? So I will actually argue that we represent the global south. We are a large population living on a fairly small land parcel, and our resources are stressed, and as Neha pointed out, we are doing this in the face of extreme climate events that are only going to increase. She mentioned 200%. The Yamuna flow rate went from 352 cusecs to 3.5 lakh cusecs in a period of one day. So one has to understand that there is a lot of that economic change that CB had referred to as being the switch between urban and rural. We need to kind of diversify our understanding of that. Right. So I will actually argue that simultaneous to urbanization is actually a process of deruralization. A lot of the rural economy stabilizes the relationship a settlement has with natural assets or long-term natural assets, right? Mm-hmm. Like water systems, right? Drainage channels, we spoke about STPs. So while you're building STPs, there are parts of the city, and now I don't mean tier 1. I think the bulk of movement to cities is not to tier 1, it's actually to tier 3, tier 4. So we are actually seeing large villages becoming small towns. So it's a sort of a almost city scenario, which we have a 100-year legacy of carrying on till it becomes a tier 1 city, like in Delhi, the problems that we are witnessing. This kind of cross-ownership or multi-layered stakeholdership on natural assets like drainage channels. So I think that the key here is for us to understand that there is a process of deruralization that accompanies urbanization. There's a need to stabilize those deruralizations. These are not very big ticket budgets that are needed for this. These are all less than 100 crore project sizes. Yes. So to that extent, muni bonds or green bonds that are issued by municipal authorities that have departments that are looking at deruralization as a separate phenomenon can issue these very locally for tax breaks that, I mean, if you look at someone with an income in India of, say, in the range of about, say, 2 lakhs or 3 lakhs a year, right? For the tax break, it's possible to go and buy municipal bonds that have ticket prices of, say, 500 bucks. Right now, the ticket prices for muni bonds are 1,000. Yes. So there is a way of looking at how you finance local bodies by increasing local stakeholdership. Simultaneous to this is also this idea of urban planning, right? And how do you retrofit or how do you prolong the life of infrastructure that you already have, so-called grey infrastructure. STPs are a great example, but I would say low-cost housing is an equally great example. We are now reaching the life cycle end of a sort of a carbonized way of construction for all these buildings. RCC and steel that was built on burning up fuel and fossil fuel. There's a lot of innovation happening in this country on generation of green hydrogen, for example. Yes. Now, when there is need for high calorific density in the fuel, high energy density in the fuel, for things like public transport systems, for things like large-scale constructions of baseline green infrastructure, green stormwater infrastructure, for example, there's no need to think of a city as cities are aggregating phenomena, and deruralization by its nature is a disaggregating phenomena. So a lot of the resilience we need for flooding, for example, would come if erstwhile areas are identified that were rural, soak like lakes, the Jal Shakti Ministry is bringing out a whole survey, a kind of GIS-led LiDAR information system on what were the low points in a city. Those need to be stabilized simultaneously. So I think this G20 presidency should be taken in the spirit that we are, in a way, pathfinders for not just us being the largest population on the planet right now, but really representing where the growth of population globally, we I think contribute about 15 or 16% of world population. We're going to be the same percentage in 2040. But how we handle deruralization, urbanization simultaneously is in many ways going to be the path for how other cities across the world urbanize. And I think we should kind of face up to that as both a challenge and an opportunity.
Chandan Bhushan.
Listening to Neha and Arjun, I think it's important to understand that we already have large private investment in our cities. Look at Gurgaon and look at a township in Gurgaon. They are bubble enclaves. They have their water supply, sewage treatment plant, building, roads, security, electricity. Everything is privatized. There's hardly any connection with the public. So I think the first question we need to ask is, what kind of private investment? Okay. Do we want the kind of private investment that is happening right now in our cities? I think that's disastrous for urbanization. Okay. We are creating enclaves where you have such categorization and ghettoization of cities right now. That's what Gurgaon is. There's no connection between a person who is providing service to a rich and the rich community. And that we have seen recently what has happened. So I also believe that it is important to understand where and how private investment is important. The importance of public good should not go away.
Right.
We pay taxes to the government, starting from municipality to central government. And that is for public good. Cities are built for public good. And it is important that that public good aspect of city is not forgotten. And the last point that I would like to make is that the entire 74th Amendment of the Constitution, if you look at it, and I'm responding to Neha, there are 18 functions which were devolved to local government, including the right of local government to raise funds. Okay. None of the states have devolved that power.
Right.
Okay. So it's not that our constitution has not looked at what kind of power is required at the local level. It's just that states are not willing to devolve power and build the kind of governance that is required in our city.
Yes,
So actually, CB, exactly. So I couldn't agree with you more. The thing is that the 74th Amendment, I mean, and you look at all of those things, also, I mean, I was also reading it, that also requires a thorough relook. You know, the financial raising powers in 74th are also very limited. The other question that you raised is also about the public good nature of how the habitable cities will be created. So equity will become extremely important. You know, so you and I are probably saying the same thing in different ways. The private investment that you're talking about is actually real estate investment, right? Mainly. And that has, so it's happening in parallel ways for service, for creation of public goods and services. You require joint ventures. There are models around that. You need to be able to look at what those structures are. For example, and let me also respond to what Madhav said, that simultaneously deruralization is happening. You actually go to tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 cities, the pace at which you wonder that sometimes you see the concrete buildings coming up, but in terms of access to services, I don't think that we have really improved the quality of living in urban areas. So our model of urbanization may not exactly and should not exactly ape how the Western cities are sort of even planned. So that, and by the way, no master plan in India actually includes climate and environmental considerations. So Mumbai has made a climate action plan that has nothing to do with the master plan of Mumbai.
Correct.
No,
So
if
there
I
are-
can jump in here. So this is an important point because Delhi's just issued its 2041
Yeah,
master plan.
master
It
plan.
has a whole kind of green-blue infrastructure sort of system running through it, system of thought. Now, exactly the point I think CB is saying, that this whole idea of privatization is for the lack of funding.
Right.
That's because municipalities are competing with each other for state funding.
State
They're not really competing at a lower ticket price at all. The fact is that if we are considering a large village becoming a town in the next 20 years, the sort of people involved in making it a town are, of course, state actors that include government departments and special purpose vehicles. You'll have areas that are declared, say, especially around the coast, that are special economic zones that are prone to, say, coastal flooding, right? Just as a thing to bring the focus back to climate. I think in many ways, if those funding mechanisms for kind of making grey infrastructure more climate responsive and for replacing aging infrastructure with more decarbonized, produced more in a much more decarbonized manner. I'll give you a good example. Other than this whole hydrogen fuel business, there's this idea of prefabricated component-based building elements. So, for example, if we have a construction type which is old, but it is fragile, that is, it never had a life that was more than 20 years. It was badly built. There is going to be an incremental change, and these are in parts of the city that are not covered by the master plan.
Right.
Most Indian cities, only about 30% are actually covered by the master plan.
Right.
So in many ways, our way of looking at urban planning and climate change and financing those kind of shifts from, say, a circular economy. Circular economy is another great question that Indian cities can have great answers for. For example, waste to new material transitions are not covered by GST. So if you have people who segregate waste and actually make it circular, there is no way they can produce, because GST is covering only new material, the production of new material. So there are ways in which urban planning, construction waste, climate science, and the sort of underlying transitions and shifts that are happening in Indian society can be great path breakers, I think, globally.
Thanks, Madhav. So we've almost done the time. So thanks, Chandrabhushan. Thanks, Neha. Thanks, Arjun. Thanks, Madhav.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vandana, and all.